In this session, I think to a very other important issue, namely the issue of what we call in English resources. Resources will be, let's say, the central issue that we will be discussing. And there is another very big difference with the previous session. That in the previous session, a practitioner was speaking, my colleague Freek Persin, and I'm not a practitioner. I'm a person speaking from the field of history and theory. So you will need to bear with me. But what I will try to show to you is indeed how history and theory can influence our viewpoints on the territory, and particularly of the importance of resources in the territory. That is what we're going to try to do in this second session. So I've titled my introduction of today, Reciprocal Urban Design, the Prospect of Another History. As a starting image, I wanted to start with this, to my taste, very fascinating image of a project of Gordon Matta Clark in the city of Paris. It's a project of 1975, where Gordon Matta Clark bored a sort of tornado-shaped hole in a building, in a building that was, of course, up for demolition as part of an urban renovation. But what always fascinated me in this particular image is indeed that it starts to reveal certain qualities of these buildings which we normally don't see. And the qualities that I'm talking about are the qualities that we clearly see, of course, the material resources of which this building is made. We understand the different layers of materials, both in the walls, but of course also in the floors. Try to look at these floors. So it's speaking about these material resources, but it's also speaking about, let's say, the spatial and the practical resources. If we start to understand that this space was used as a kitchen space, if we look at its tiling. So in some kind of way, what this image is doing for me is really showing how much the architecture of the city or urban design is related to particular resources, material resources, resources that have to do with particular ways of constructing as well, knowledge of construction as well, which is revealed here. And to me, it also makes me aware of how much the field of urban design, and I would say even the field of Baukultur, has been operating until right now from a certain position of what I would call epistemic ignorance about these resources. By epistemic ignorance, I mean that indeed the field of urban design has been considering far too little of which resources buildings and neighborhoods are composed. This is really, let's say, the starting point. And this epistemic ignorance is not something that only practitioners share, but is also something that historians and historiography have been very complicit to. I would say that our field is let's say, characterized with what I would call sort of resource amnesia. The way that historians have been talking about urban design, about urban planning, was always in terms of big visions, ideas, concepts, let's say, and pretending, and that's the bottom part of my slide, pretending as if these resources, these material resources, these resources which have to do with how to construct buildings and neighborhoods, they were abundantly and effortlessly present. So this is my starting point. It's a sort of mirror that I'm trying to keep up, maybe to all of you. I know that many of you are practitioners in this field. I think we've been thinking far too little about these resources. That's what I want to get across. And when I'm saying we, I include practitioners, but certainly also historians, and that's what I also want to talk a bit about. So this is a bit strange because when we look at the field of urban design, we see that the field of urban design is dealing with many challenges. Challenges of thinking about material sustainability, for instance, thinking about how old materials can be reused. There's a very big discourse on urban mining, for instance. So how can we use the resources that are already there in territories in new ways? Of course, also connected to these notions of repair and so on. I mean, we all know these notions that are very present at the moment. The field of urban design is, of course, also connected or very much engaged with questions of climate change. Also there, I think, you know that people like Sascha Rössler, for instance, working at the Accademia di Mendrisio here, has been arguing that indeed this is one of the big challenges that our field is facing. Or, of course, the field of urban design being confronted with social questions. To me, these social questions, they're also very much related to debates, for instance, on commoning. How do we common the resources that we have in our cities as well? So, rather remarkably, let's say, there is, on the one hand, we have this resource amnesia, we could say, but on the other hand, the field of urban design is faced with many, many challenges that are indeed almost directly related to this research question. That's what I want to get across, to meet the sort of ambiguity that we're living in the field at this very moment. So what I'm going to do today is to get across a sort of plea, a sort of statement, a plea for alternative histories of urban design, alternative histories of urban design, which in my mind can also strongly influence the practice of urban design. That's what I would like to get across. And of course, when we speak about alternative histories of urban design, I could follow many, many paths. I just want to make you aware of that. I could follow a path, for instance, saying, I need to write an alternative history of urban design more from a gender perspective. For instance, accounting for the many, many women that played very important roles in urban design. I'm having two here, Carmen Pontinho in Brazil and Jacoba Mulder in the Netherlands. When I'm speaking about alternative histories of urban design, I could also make a plea to indeed write more global histories of urban design. Until right now, many of our histories of urban design, they're focused on Europe and the North Americas. Learning from other geographies, a bit like this map, would also be a possibility. Or third possibility of writing an alternative history of urban design would be to speak about histories of urban design which are not only about architects and urban planners, but which are also about the many other actors, people who are in politics, who are in governance, and who are indeed, I think, equally influential in urban design as well, including citizens. For instance, I had here the example of Jamie Lerner, for instance, a very nice example of a mayor in Curitiba who really changed urban design in his particular city. But this is not a revision that I'm trying to suggest to you today. So I could do all of these revisions, but this is not a revision that I'm trying to suggest to you today. I'm trying to suggest to you a very different revision of our histories of urban design. And in order to grasp the revision that I'm suggesting, I think it's good to understand what sort of histories of urban design, what sort of perspectives of urban design do we have at this very moment. The first type of histories of urban design that we have at this very moment are histories of urban design that tell the history of urban design through the lens of urban composition. This is a very, very long tradition in the history of urban design, which maybe goes back to the late 19th century, to these types of books like Camillo Sitte. I think you're all familiar with this book, De Städtebau nach seinen künstlichen Grundsätzen, where indeed the argument is very, very strongly that urban design is all about composition, the Beziehung zwischen Bauten, Monumenten und Plätzen. It's all about these very, very strict urban compositions. And if we look in the books of Sitte, we typically find these sort of images where you have a plan that speaks about this urban composition and a perspective that underlines the beauty or the balance of this urban composition, mediating between buildings, public spaces, and monuments, as you see here as well. This is a very, very long-standing tradition, also well into the 20th century. This is the so-called history which is called the American Vitruvius. That's Hegemann and Pietz from the 1920s. And when we look in these books, we see that again it's about urban composition, it's about squares, as you see here, or it's about streets and public spaces, but again all focused on this matter of urban composition. And I challenge you, I think indeed, if you think about the histories of urban design, that you will see time and time again that they've been focusing on urban design as a matter of urban composition. Admittedly very important, but I think it's a bit restrictive. That's what I try to get across. The second way of looking at these histories of urban design is that these histories of urban design have been written from a sort of social, ideological perspective. Particularly in the 1960s, we have these types of histories of urban design emerging. People like Leonardo Bellovolo, who say that the history of urban design should be understood as a matter of big social ideas, social ideologies. If we look at the German translation of this same book, you see this very clearly. The title here is Die soziale Ursprünge des modernen Städtebau. The idea that urban design is all about social questions. That's a sort of second category, let's say, that we have. Again, admittedly, very, very important to understand urban design as a social method, but in my opinion, too restrictive. And then there is a third, let's say, pedigree of the histories of urban design, which is indeed focusing on urban design as the outcome of technical or technological advancement. That's typically what we see in these types of books. This is Siegfried Gideon, as many of you might know, of course, a Swiss historian and theoretician. In his book, Bouwen in Frankrijk, Eisen, Eisenbeton, here in the English translation, Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferroconcrete, he's making an argument that the history of urban design should be looked upon as a history of technological advancement. And when we look at the pages of his book, we typically see that he's saying that the technological advancement of reinforced concrete is indeed propelling the development of urban design, the development of the city, we could say as well. So let's say, tendencies, three in the history of urban design, which I think are very, very strong, and I would say dominant until this very moment. I challenge you all to think of the histories of urban design that you know. I'm sure that they fit in one of the history in these three categories. So what I'm suggesting right now is that these histories of urban design, and thereby also our theories or our perspectives on urban design, they're a bit outdated, and that we need a new sort of history. A new sort of history, or histories, which I would call reciprocal histories. Reciprocal histories where we do no longer understand urban design solely as a matter of form, as a matter of social questions, as a matter of technical questions, but where we start to understand urban design as a sort of reciprocal trajectories of resources, of various resources. That's what I want to get across. And these resources, they take various forms. These resources can be knowledges and practices that are available in the territory. Think about a certain type of craftsmanship, a certain way of building. These resources can be materials and natural resources. Think about, indeed, a particular type of stone, typical other natural resources, but these resources can also be existing forms and spaces which are present in the territory. So that's what I'm going to try to prove to you, that we can start to think these histories of urban design in a new way, and that by thinking these histories of urban design in a new way, we can also maybe rethink the practice of urban design a bit. So, interestingly enough, when we look back at the histories of urban design, the already existing histories of urban design, we find small indexes of rethinking these histories. We see that there are some examples in the long history of urban design where people have tried to understand urban design as closely related to the knowledges and the practices that are present in a territory. Let me give you an example. This is a very old example. It's an 18th century example, 1766, Henri Louis Duhamel, who indeed is describing the development of urban design in relation to various construction knowledges. Construction knowledges of which he says that they are particular to particular places in the territory. And for instance, that a particular construction knowledge which is present in cities, for instance, here, the construction knowledge of particular roofing is indeed different from the construction knowledges that are present in more rural areas, and that is explaining, partially at least, the difference between the built environment in urban and in rural areas. A very early example of a sort of history that understands the importance of practices of construction, crafts, and their presence in the territory, and tries to understand the relation of urban design to these resources that are present in the territory. But there are other examples. If we go into the 20th century, we have, for instance, the work of Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish biologist, but also an urban planner. And Patrick Geddes, very well known, makes this what he calls this valley section. This is a section where he's cutting through the territory, and he's showing how, let's say, practices of quarrying, meaning sourcing stone, or practices of forestry, meaning sourcing wood, how they are important to understand the developments of cities. So this is an idea of understanding how these practices are located in the territories as resources and how they inform the actual development of the city and understanding their reciprocity. The development of the city and the development of practices of constructing, of quarrying in this case, and of forestry, they are interrelated. But also, I think a very well-known publication to many of you here in this room, the publication of Aldo Rossi, the 1966 publication of Aldo Rossi, in English, The Architecture of the City, L'architettura della città, in which indeed also Rossi is speaking about the relation between the knowledges of construction and the development of the city. So this is for me a first type of resources that we should start to think much more forcefully when we think about the histories of urban design, and I would say also when we think about the practices of urban design. How does urban design relate to the resources of construction practices that are present in the territory? The second types of resources that I want to talk about is indeed the material and the natural resources that are present in our territories. I think, surprisingly so, for a very long time, urban design has almost been acting against these resources, as if these resources were unknown, I would say. And there again, when we look at the history at the histories of urban design that exist, we have very, very nice examples. This is an example of Émile Gérard, 1908, who's speaking about Paris and the development of Paris. And what Gérard is doing is publishing these types of maps, and these types of maps in orange and in green, you see the quarries in Paris. The quarries where stone was quarried in the orange part. This is the so-called calcaire grossier. And in green, you see where the gypsum was sourced, where the gypsum was quarried. Again, we see, of course, the plan of Paris, and we start to understand how indeed this understanding of the material resources in the territory, in the ground, directly relates to what is built on top of the ground, as you can see in this combination of these two images as well. He was not the only one. Gérard was not the only one. There were other people like Adolphe Chauvin, who also speaks about the development of Paris, and speaks about indeed the transportation of materials into the city along the Seine, and how this indeed enabled the big project of Haussmann in Paris, the big boulevards, which we all appreciate so much. Again, a sort of relation between material resources and the way that the city is developing, the way that urban design was developed. And there are many other examples. One more example from another city. This is Edward Suze, as you can see, who's speaking about Vienna, and who speaks about the material resources that are natural material resources, but also the man-made material resources in the city. Making these types of maps, where he's very, very carefully mapping the ground of the city, the materials that were there, and trying to connect that indeed to the way that the city developed. Again, trying to make a connection between materials and city, between the ground, we could say, and what is happening on top of the ground. Here again, this seems to be maybe very obvious, but I think it's a sort of connection, an understanding of the relation between urban design and resources that we've forgotten for a too long time. I'm really serious about this. But there are other people. Now I'm taking you to the 1960s, to the work of the American landscape architect, urban designer, Eimer Garg, who indeed published this book in 1969, Designing with Nature, where he's not only looking at the material resources that are present in the territory, but also the natural resources that are present in the territory. Speaking, for instance, about water, but as you can maybe see in a very, very sophisticated way, also understanding the aquifers, that means the water that is locked in the ground, really understanding that in a very, very precise way, but also understanding other natural resources like woodlands, agricultural lands, as you see here. Also, these are these woodlands, very detailed studies. And what Avermaete is doing is that he's mapping these natural resources in the territory, mapping them as you see here, very, very detailed mapping, but also trying to explain how urbanization, how urban patterns, they react to these particular conditions, to these particular resources. Here we see, I think, these fantastic drawings where he's trying to explain how the existence of particular natural resources, water, woodlands, indeed also determines the organization of the territory. I think in a very, very new way. Here again, you see that he's really understanding, let's say, the territory in its entirety, moving from towns and cities, smaller settlements, also to the surrounding agriculture, and again, all relating that to these resources that are present in the territory, these natural resources. A last type of resources that I want to talk about is the resource of, which is, I think, maybe the closest to the viewpoints or the perspectives of many architects and urban planners, is the resource of forms and spaces that are already present in the territory. So not the idea that we design new forms, new spaces, but an understanding of forms and spaces as resources that already are located in the territory. And also there, I think it's interesting to look a bit at some of the histories that have been written already. This history is, of course, the history of Saverio Muratori, Studia per una perante storia urbana di Venezia. And what Muratori is showing here is doing a very, very, let's say, detailed analysis of how the existing urban fabric of Venice indeed determines the future of Venice. Doing these types of mapping, but I'm particularly interested in what you see here to the right-hand side, where he's mapping the same combination of three houses surrounding a cortile in the 14th century, in the 16th century, and in the 20th century. And here you see how some of that urban form remains stable, but some of that urban form, particularly at the level of the interior, is changing. This is this capacity of the urban form as a resource that can be transformed, that can be adapted, that can be reinterpreted through the time. Again, I think it's a sort of resource or a reading of the city, a reading of the territory that I think deserves even more attention today as well. Muratori is one example, but to go one more time back to Rossi, also Rossi is an example. I think that you all remember these types of drawings of Rossi's books, where he's indeed showing that a certain urban form first is an amphitheater in Roman times, but then later on becomes reinterpreted as an urban neighborhood. That's what I mean about understanding urban forms as resources that are present in the territory. So what I try to sketch for you right now is indeed an idea of histories of urban design that would indeed connect very, very strongly to this idea of resources that are knowledges and practices that are present in the territory, resources that are materials and natural resources, and resources that are forms and spaces. I think that we as urban designers or urban theoreticians urgently need to change our historiographies, urgently need to change our theories. I think the same goes for practice, for urban design practice. So what I'm telling here is that I'm making a sort of plea for what I would call sort of reciprocal practice of urban design. And when we think a reciprocal practice of urban design in relation to these resources, these various resources that I've introduced, then I think we also start to rethink the role of the urban designer. The urban designer is no longer somebody who is indeed planning something new, doing a radical proposal for the future, but I have the feeling that that would mean that the urban designer is more understood as somebody who is a caretaker of these various resources. Somebody who engages with these resources, takes care of these resources. Again, the resources understood as knowledges and practices, material and natural resources, and forms and spaces. So this is something that I also would like to discuss with my colleagues here. It also means, I think, that urban designers, those who are practicing urban design, they need to create a new sort of literacy, a new sort of intelligence in better understanding these resources that are located in the territory. Really, I mean, learning to read more precisely, more detailed. That's what I'm calling this kind of intelligence or this literacy for these resources. I'm saying this a bit provocatively, while knowing, of course, that many of my colleagues already have this type of literacy. And then the last point that I wanted to make is that I also think that when we understand urban design as a reciprocal practice in relation to these resources, I also think that we start to redefine what an urban project is. How do we understand an urban project? I think that we understand that an urban project no longer as something that is superimposed on these resources, but rather something that is intervening, engaging with these different resources. And for me, I think that that's also a bit of a paradigm shift, that we no longer understand urban design as something that controls, superimposes itself on these resources, but engages, intervenes. So that is why I used in my title this idea of the prospect of a reciprocal history of urban design. I think that this idea of writing different histories, which are more connected to these resources, is important for people like myself who write these histories, who write these theories. But I also have the feeling that it's indeed a sort of invitation for those of you who are in urban design practice and who think about the future of Baukultur, I would say as well. I think indeed this practice, in my mind, can only move forward by greater awareness of these resources, a literacy for these resources, that's one. Secondly, a redefinition of what the role of the urban designer means in relation to these resources. And third, and last but not least, I would say, also a redefinition of what the project of urban design means, no longer superimposing, but engaging and intervening with these resources. So that's it. Thank you.